when I was a little girl on the farm, I wanted a pony. And my parents wouldn't buy me a pony. So, first of all, I painted the pony. That's me with my pony in that self-portrait against the wall. That's the pony that I wanted, and that's my portrait. You can see my...
So what age are we talking?
Well, there I'm 5.
Wow.
But then as I got older, I didn't get a pony till I was around 8. I made a pony. And, living on the farm, there were sawhorses and things around. So I took a sawhorse and made a head and a tail and a saddle, and I'd sit on it until I tormented my parents, and they finally bought me a pony.
Wow.
So I was making things, and then whenever there was a high school float, I made the float, or whenever there was even a college Panhellenic. I was in a sorority at the University of Tennessee, so I was, that changed overnight too when I went to Arizona. But I made all the displays that we did for all the football games and everything. So I had been building things, ever since I was a kid. So it wasn't a hard transition at all. It was just a matter of realizing that was the art, not the painting. I mean, what I needed to.
I guess that first work, was it small scale? Was it ceramic? What was the art world's perception of 3D work at that time? I mean, I know Eva Hess was, doing some interesting things with resin and things at the time, but run of the mill, where would you have been starting at that point?
Well, where I started was with ceramics, because that was certainly a perfect venue for making sculpture in any kind of way. I didn't need a crane, I didn't need chisels, I could easily make ceramic sculpture. And interestingly enough, the ceramic sculpture I made early on relates in a great deal to the sculpture, the larger things I do now, with a bit of a narrative to it and a bit of structure as well as organic form. And when I look back, I go, wow, I was doing it then. I left it for a while then when I became a full-fledged sculptor to be more abstract, and I took out all the imagery and so forth. And I'm kind of jumping ahead of your question.
No, it's okay.
But somewhere along the line, and actually it was, I could date it, but I was making abstract sculpture, and I realized that I wanted to incorporate something, I felt something was missing for me, and I realized what it was is something figurative, something human that I could work with, because I see now that my message is really about the human being and the human condition. Right. And so consequently, matter of fact, this painting over here above the table was done around the same time, the time that I began to allow myself to put the figure or the organic form into the abstract sculpture. Right. And part of my reasoning was I was kind of lonesome for my girlfriends, which a couple of them moved away, and so I made them. I made these large figures, and this one is called the 5 Women. So there are 5 women in that relief on the wall. Right. And then I also physically made, it took me a long time to develop techniques for my sculpture that weren't traditional, that worked for me. Right. Again, because I said I didn't want to do the traditional sculptural media. And I discovered that if I made work with small bits of things, particularly at that time small sticks, that then I could build big things. Right. I always wanted to make it big. I have a real almost problem with scale. I love scale. I love really, and I have actually a slight problem making things small. Right. Now, because we have this big space, and I want work big, but at least it tends to be life size or bigger most of the time. So anyway, I figured out techniques that I could use that were all mine, that would translate and also not end up with things that couldn't be lifted by me or couldn't be manipulated by me. Later, I had many of those pieces cast in bronze, which helped the marketability of them.
Right.
But, and helped the longevity of them for sure.
Sure.
But they were originally made with splintered shingles that then were nail pinned together and formed, a structural form that was, though, organic.
But even the way you describe that work then, it sounds a lot like your work now in terms of, I see a lot of forms that allude to the figure. They're like figurative components by themselves, may not even be recognized as being part of the body, but as you start assembling around it, they take on human form and easy to lift. I mean, the fact that I think you use a lot of foam.
I do now, yeah.
Right. And
those early pieces I called vessel figures because I made them as if they were, pots, interspersed in this timeline is a year in England working as an apprentice potter with Michael Leach, who was Bernard Leach's son. And I actually made production pottery to the 16th of an inch. I mean, calibrated to be dinnerware. But and so in making ceramic sculpture, I had also the skill to be a potter. And my ex-husband and I ran a pottery in Georgia, in Macon, Georgia, actually. Wow. And so I was always interested in the fact that a pot has a belly, a lip, a foot, a neck, and all those body parts. At least that's the way they're described. So then when I started making sculpture, I made enormous shapes that were figurative but not. They were some hybrid between a pot and a body with belly and foot and lip and then open.
Right.
But they weren't closed. They were made as a structure, so they were, air flowed through, their visual flowed through, but I call them vessel figures, my very first ones. So then from there went beyond, and I do use a lot of foam because I want it, again, big and light, and I want form, and I want to control that form, and foam is real easy to do that.
So you've been using foam for a while.
Quite a while.
Do you find that it's holding up over time?
Some does and some doesn't. It will for sure if you coat it.
Right.
Then you're fine. But I actually really like the way it looks when it's not coated, so I have to talk myself into coating something. But that's where the line is drawn as to whether if it gets air and sun, it won't.
You go to England. You wind up coming back to Georgia, set a pottery studio. How did you make it to Texas?
Well, and so my ex-husband and I moved from Georgia to Texas for him to teach at North Texas. So we lived in Denton, and I proceeded to get a second master's, this time in sculpture, while in Denton. And that was great. Of course, my husband was part of the faculty, and I was taking courses, which is normal, and people do that. But I felt that I got a lot of opportunity there to do what I wanted to, and to really experiment with things. North Texas was a great place for trying out ideas.
Sure.
And so I got an MFA in sculpture there.
Great. And
then when we broke up and our marriage ended, I moved to Dallas and he stayed there. And it broke up a little bit because I didn't want to use clay anymore, and he was so devoted to clay. He felt in a way that I had abandoned him by abandoning the material. At least that's what he said. So consequently, I stopped using clay and haven't gone back since, although sometimes I think I ought to make us a dinnerware set, because I've certainly got those skills.
So at that point, you start making work, sculpture. You're using mixed media of different types, right, to make forms.
And I was teaching full time.
Okay.
I came to Dallas, and I got a full time job teaching at Mountain View College, and then I was there a few years, and then went to UTD and helped develop that whole art program, because at the time they didn't have an art department.
Right.
And there were several of us that were brought in at that point in time, and I don't know if you've heard all the controversy over the fact they lost the art barn, and they've been moved into regular classrooms and buildings on campus. But the group that I was involved with in developing that program actually had designed the building with the architects to be an art-friendly structure. It's very cutting edge, won a whole lot of awards architecturally. And so that I spent my next 5 years teaching there.
Right. Great.
But after I left UTD, I did then become a full-time artist, and pardon me, but would teach an adjunct class at various schools in the area, and it was great to keep my interaction with the students and to keep my just there's a real great thing about teaching.
Sure.
That once you stop, it's hard to go back. But I taught a lot at SMU. I taught at Mountain View again. I taught at Richland. I taught at Brookhaven. I did a whole lot.
I know there was work that I saw that you did, what was it called, like Weather Report?
Right.
And that was an installation that you had done where those figurative elements were, really kind of alluded to under everything's covered in cloth, right?
Uh-huh.
And can you
well, they did. I think you were about to say this, but you didn't. But they alluded to classical sculpture for sure. And I do have a very strong affection for classical sculpture. That I remember in my early art history classes, just being so impressed by Bernini, especially because of his ability to create that emotion in the bodies. Although in that Weather Report installation you're talking about, they're rather stiff classical poses, and that was to make a point about sort of the status quo,
right?
Or the structure, the hierarchy of our society. But yes, they're all covered in cloth, and interestingly enough, that installation was done when Bush had just declared war on Iraq, and I was so depressed about it that the whole thing totally changed. It was going to be quite colorful and still with a similar sort of elements arranged not exactly like they ended up, but all the joy had gone out of me, so the whole thing turned gray.
Right. And
so I changed all the cloth to gray and changed a few other things and then titled it Weather Report in a way to try sort of speak of the tone of where we were.
Your process, do you start conceptually, or do you just get your hands on materials and start dabbling and things emerge, or are you responding to...
Well, interesting question, because I often have intention. I think a lot about concept, and I'll have intention, but I almost never follow my I'll outline what I think I'm headed toward, but I almost never totally follow it, because for me the real excitement about art is for the art to talk back to me, to say, wait a minute, this is not you need to try this instead. So the process, and